Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday or Wednesday. For you of those who are in Australia and the wonderful places in the West Pacific. I I'm going to start. I think it's a little bit of humor. From time to time, I get people emailing me and they say, "Sponsor me, sponsor me," and I got another one yesterday from somebody, and his email to me was, "Hi, Rusty Surfboards. I was wondering if you could give me a deal on any board so I can rip it. Please get back to me if you can." I usually send them kind of a polite answer. So I sent this guy a very polite answer. I said, "Hi, blank, blank, blank. Thanks for inquiring. My suggestion is that you send us 10 of your best surf photos, at least 10 minutes of your top footage, all of your social media regarding surfing. Don't really care for Facebook, so Instagram works. You need to have at least you have to have at least 50,000 followers to qualify, and any contest results that you have. A 1,000-word essay on why you should deserve a deal and what you will do in return. Waiting." I mean, there's a bit of truth to my response to him, but usually you come up on our radar through the online media these days. But anyways, now to more serious issues. I get people requesting carbon down the center of their board, and more often than not, it's on the deck. And we have a model. It's a big guy model, and it's usually ordered like 7/6 and longer, and it's usually ordered quite thick. So carbon adds strength. But it adds a certain type of strength. It adds shear strength, but it adds a degree of stiffness. You think of a board glass with 4 ounce on the bottom and 6 on top, and a layer, a strip of carbon down the center on the top. How much strength do you think that adds? Well, it will most likely not buckle from the deck. It is highly likely to buckle from the bottom. If you were to put the carbon on the bottom, it would balance out the structure. Sure, it might make the board a slight touch stiffer, but the benefit of the added strength far outweighs the flex issue. On a high-performance shortboard, it can help. The thinner the board on the bottom, and it can help keep the board from buckling. The closer together two surfaces are, the more flex. The opposite is true of thicker boards, approximately 2 3/4 inches thicker. They have less flex and are less likely to break. On most of the guns in the high 8s and above, I usually advise 6 and 4 top and 6 bottom. So actually it's bottom weighted. And the reason is usually when you're riding big waves, your wave count drops, but the intensity is way up. But you don't catch nearly as many waves, so denting isn't really an issue. By going the extra 6 ounce as opposed to the 6 and 4 bottom, you add strength where it is needed the most. Imagine a stick with some bend in it. Which way do you think it will break the easiest, with the bend or against the bend? So my point is, in my humble opinion, that the carbon on the deck, it adds a little bit of strength, but it doesn't add it where it's needed the most. It's really more of a cosmetic thing. Looks cool, and it the added benefit you get from it, the thinner the board is, usually it's all glass 4 ounce. A strip of carbon might not be a bad idea, especially if you have a history of breaking boards. But we're going to. I'm going to have this little letter I wrote up. I'm going to put it in our blog. But there's there's tons of interesting questions that it makes me realize that I've been around for a while, and I take it for granted that you people know the answers, or you can get them on the internet. But I sent you. Did you? What are some questions that are getting there?
Did you text it to me?
Well, but are you seeing any good questions off the?
No, in the comments. River Girl Regina says she loves her custom Rusty.
Thank you, Roberta.
Joey Green says even a short high performance board? Question mark.
Oh yeah, there is another email I got from. I got a couple good ones today. One guy, he's coming off of. Once again, he's coming off a 7.6 kind of longboard, and he wants to get a 6-foot heckler. And once again, I've talked about this several times, but surfing is a very, very difficult sport. I think it's one of the most challenging sports, or arts, whatever you want to call it. You probably shouldn't tackle more than 6 inches at a time. 6 inches is quite a bit on a surfboard. If you go from a 7.6 to a 6-foot board, you'll be struggling. I mean, you'll be struggling to catch waves. You'll be struggling to make waves. So why not just make the transition a little bit easier for yourself? Go from 7.6 to say 7 foot. Make sure you keep it kind of wide and thick, and I guarantee you, you'll enjoy surfing a lot more. Another question. You got another question there, Karen?
Roberto Chavez is praising you. Rusty surfboards best in El Salvador.
Another question is, what do channels do for a surfboard? My first experience with channels was like 76 or 77, an Australian. Started using them, and that's at a time when Bali was it was kind of just coming on the map. It had been surfed for several years before that, but it was starting to become on the map. And so this fella, I'm sorry, the name's escaping me right now, but this fella started putting channels in the bottom of the board, kind of like the bottom of a boat has the ridges following, and it's. I believe it does a couple things. One is it redirects the water flow. Instead of it spilling off the sides, it redirects it to go off the rear of the board. The deeper the channels, the greater the effect. And it also helps loosen the board up rail to rail because it breaks up. Back then, if we had concaves, they're very, very, very slight. But so it would help the board go over on a rail, and it would give it a lot of drive, a lot of, not even squirt, but just drive out of a turn. And in the early days, I think most of the channel bottoms were 6 deep ones that started around the sweet spot, about a third of the way up, and they ran deep off the tail. And as time went by, people started experimenting more and more. Um, uh, you know, more channels, 8 channels, 10 channels. I made a 10 channel egg for a friend back in 77 or 78. And I personally, at the end of the single fin era, I was writing mostly channels because I found that I could go with a much wider tail because they held. They add the extra hold along with the thrust out the back and the rail to rail freedom. And the third factor is, yeah, they added a lot of hold. So I was able to ride, some single fins with. And back at the end of the single fin era, the average tail width was maybe 14 and a quarter or a half. But I was able to start riding boards with 15 and a half. I remember one board I had a 16-inch tail, and it worked insane. And I could feel the channels. With the advent of the thrusters in early 81, the three fins completely changed the dynamic of surfing. The noses got much narrower, the tails got much wider, and the boards would hold. And if the fin setup was right, they'd have a little bit of squirt or thrust. And then people started fooling around with I seem to remember belly channels where the board has 4 channels about 2 inches off the stringer and then 4 inches off the stringer, or 2.5 and 5 inches off the stringer, but basically down the center of the board, running starting around the middle and running and disappearing as they came towards the fins. And the purpose of those was to get, you get a little bit of squirt, with the water flow redirection. But I think more so with the 4-channel boards, you got, the rail to rail. You got the rail to rail freedom. You didn't get as much hold because they were basically pretty shallow, and they didn't run off the tail, so you didn't get as much. You got a little bit of extra thrust, but you got you got a fair bit more rail to rail freedom. And so moving forward to modern times, like I offer the blade with a concave bottom, and that bottom is, I think about 0.3 is about as deep as you can. You can go deeper, but a 0.3 concave bottom is about the deepest, and it's usually just like a foot behind the wide point or the center point, and it's fairly deep in the center of the board. It starts basically almost up in the nose and it gets deeper and deeper as it runs through the wide point. It gets deepest about a foot back, a foot and a half back, and it starts to shallow out. The blade with the channels is a much laterally flatter bottom. It's maybe got 0.1, 0.12 concave at the deepest point, and it's got 4 medium depth channels that run off the tail, which will add a little bit more hold and definitely give you a little bit more squirt out of the turns. Or not so much for the blade, but for the boards of the deeper channels, we found that surface conditions bump affect the way they work. It makes them almost working not against you, but it makes the ride much more difficult because of the turbulence under the board. When the surf's bumpy, I look back at the Eve model that Morris Cole developed, the reverse V, and he says it was an accident. I think he's full of shit, but he said he had a computer shape, and he always starts shaping like at 3 a.m, and he said he started shaping the board at the wrong end. He started shaping the board backwards, and that's why he had the V up front instead of in the rear. anyways, the reverse V, where there's a little a bit of V up in the entry, and maybe a little bit deeper in front of the front foot, and then it zeroes out in the last 18 inches, and actually there's a little bit of tail flip. That kind of bottom is actually good for a little bit of bump. I've got some friends that surf the ranch quite often, and several of them have reverse V boards because it's, it gets pretty strong offshores or side winds, and there's a bit of bump on that wave sometimes. There's about, I don't know how many breaks up there, but there's usually a lot of wind on it, and they've found that having the V up front is actually helpful. It smooths the ride out. And so I drifted off channels, but I can add channels to any shape really. I might need to change the bottom slightly. If it's got a heavier concave, I might need to flatten it out. But I can put belly channels or deep channels off the tail on any design. It's really a lot of the design elements of a surfboard are interchangeable. Did you get the email with the questions I sent you?
No.
No, you did. Okay.
I have one question from Joey Green.
Yeah.
He wants to know, living in Florida, I was looking at the SD for a hurricane swell board. What are your thoughts on that?
This fellow lives in Florida and he's looking at an SD for a hurricane swell. Well, I mean, if your go-to board is like a fish or a dward or something like that, when the swell gets bigger, you would probably need a board that's a little longer, a little narrower, and definitely more rocker. The SD is like one of our most popular shortboards, and it's got the deepest concave, and it's got a fair bit of rocker. That'd be a good one. But I mean, our step-up boards are the Slayer 2 or the Blackbird. And they don't, I mean, you can just go up a couple 3 inches off of what you're riding every day, and that should do the trick. A lot of people, when they get their second board, get a step up, 2, 3, 4 inches longer than their performance shortboard or their go-to shortboard. What else we got?
What's more important for stability, rail profile or surface foil?
Surface foil. Or what's more important for stability?
Rail profile
or
is it
rail profile or the bottom contours. I mean, the most important factor in stability on a board is the area, the overall area. And that's why a lot of those boards made in Asia, the soft boards, the $100 specials at Costco and whatnot, they're basically big blobs. They're longboards, longboard shapes with big rails and pretty flat rocker and pretty flat laterally. All those things add up to stability, and if you had the narrower you make the board, the less stable it is. There is a trend towards very narrow shortboards when Kelly Slater first came on the scene. I mean, it pushed a lot of my team riders run 18 and a half, give or take, and when Kelly came along, they all had to have boards under 18 inches. And sure, they work pretty good in the pocket, but the minute you left the pocket, the boards, because they were so narrow, they didn't really have much planing area, and so they bogged. And they're also doesn't concern the pros so much, but they're pretty unstable too. So width is, I think, width is the biggest factor in stability. Width is the biggest factor. Then the area, the nose and tail area, they need to be wider. Concave, when you start to get into deeper concaves, it becomes very flighty from rail to rail. I mean, you can turn them, you can put them on a rail, and they move. But for more of a beginning surfer, I think shallower concaves are a better idea. And when I get into boards, say 7, 6, 8 foot that are 22.5 inches wide or more, I start to lose the concave, and I start to go to a slight convex on the bottom, like maybe a slight break in the middle, but maybe up to 1/4 inch of E in the sweet spot. So, and the rail thickness too. I mean, if you like, I'll keep repeating this, but if you take your question and you stretch it to an extreme, yeah, very very thin rails. If you have two boards the same width, and you have one with very thin rails and one with very full blocky rails, which one do you think is going to be more stable? It's it's the fuller rails. So, another question.
What's your favorite bottom contour?
What's my favorite bottom contour? Bottom contours, I can't really say, because the different contours work in different conditions. Like I mentioned earlier, the reverse V works pretty good in windy conditions. A moderately convex bottom with a slight, medium V doesn't work that good on a low volume board, but it works good on higher volume boards and the higher planing, the wider, the fuller the planing surface is. Just because as you get wider, it becomes more difficult to tip a board. And then on the short boards, the relatively low volume boards, by all means, concave, nose to tail single. I always refer to the sweet spot, which is kind of between the fins and the midpoint, where you do most of your turning more towards your back foot. That's usually where I have the deepest part of my concaves. We've got several models, like the Barking Spider, where it's actually a little bit deeper concave, just in front of center, but it's not a very deep concave, but it's a feeder concave. And but most of the time for small wave, for low volume boards, I think single to double is a great bottom for those of you that adds a little bit more rail to rail control, and a deeper single adds a lot more squirt, but it does make the board a little bit twitchier. We got another question there.
See. What are some good rusty models across wave range, probably to step up?
What are... yes, I got it.
Green.
Somebody wanted to know when the Zeke model is coming out. We're planning on releasing it in the next couple months. It's a shorter, wider board with grab rails and a fairly deep concave, and it's like a high performance short board. It's not really a groveler, but it's a fuller high performance short board. And Zeke, of course, surfs quite well on it, and a few other people that I've shared the design with have really been liking it. So probably find the Zeke model out on the market in the next couple of months. Somebody had a similar question about the eggs. When are they going to be available online? Probably in the next month. I mean, I'm making them. I'm making quite a few, actually. As I think I said last week, Huntington Surf and Sport should have six new eggs as of today or tomorrow. Or you can go online and ask me about an egg, ask me to design one, and but in terms of visuals, how to custom build an egg, that's probably about a month and a half out. But it's the egg's been around for, geez, I don't know, 50 years, and a lot of people have made them over the years. And the traditional egg is the full template, where the nose is maybe 16, and the tail is about the same width. It's basically a double ender, and most eggs come with a bit lower rocker, and with some kind of a convex bottom, and thinner rails, like even a 60-40 rail. The newer version I'm offering has a little bit more nose rocker, and a bit more tail rocker, and the bottom goes from very, very slight V through the center of the board into a double barrel, semi-pronounced double barrel as you come into the fins. And the rails are they're pretty much like a modern shortboard rail. So they're still fairly thin. You can still get them in the water. And the board's designed, they're good funnel around boards, especially considering most places, excuse me, the average surf you have. And, the boards I've been making have been 6'10" to 8 foot, but I can make a 6 foot egg, and those they've been a timeless board for a reason, because they have a fair bit of planing area, and with the right amount of rocker, you can turn them, you can bring them up the face fairly easily. I had a board from Skip Fry. I didn't make it for me, but I tried it once when I was at G&S. About 73, I think, and it was an 8.2 egg, and it was wide. It was 23. It was pretty thin, but it was flat as an ironing board. And I remember it used to catch quite well, but I spent more time trying to prevent the nose from purling than I actually did. I eventually got it. I just could only surf it in smaller, softer waves that were kind of lined up, and it was a great trimmer. And the modern version I'm making has almost the same tail rocker as a short board or a step-up board, but the nose rocker is a bit more than a traditional egg, but not as much as a performance short board or a mid-range board. What other questions do you have?
What's the difference between the Dwart and the Dwart 2?
The difference, what is the difference between the Dwart, which is probably one of our all-time best sellers and is currently still very, very popular, and the Dwart 2. The Dwart, as I've said many times, is actually a mistake. It was a true fish that was shaped in the outgoing rack, and somebody bumped it and knocked one of the pins off of it, and Rick Hammond graciously saved it by putting a double wing round pin on it. So that's the name Dwart, D-W-R-T, round tail, a double wing round tail. And it's like a fish. It's got very, very low rocker. It's got a semi-flat deck and a pretty full rail. And the bottom is, I do single concaves, single to doubles. I don't like doing full singles on them because it's just, with the extra width, I feel like it sort of makes it more difficult to put the rail in the water. So I do a triple concave, or I do Venturi bottoms on them. The Dwart 2 is people that wanted, they like the fullness of the outline, but they wanted a squash tail. And it's got a thinner rail. It's got a more performance rail, and it's got a little bit more rocker than the original Dort. And it's a good groveler. It's a good small wave board. It doesn't have the same glide as the Dort, though. And I think that's the thing that makes the Dort so popular. Is it's got, for a short board, because it's got some width and thickness, it's got a bit of glide, and because of the double wings breaking down the area and the tail, you're able to bring it up the face easier. Traditional fishes tend to want to run more horizontal along the wave face, and as you watch surfers, no matter how good they are, that you see them. The board has its own line it wants to take, and the good surfers can figure it out, and they can do the longer sweeping turns. But you watch an average surfer trying to ride a fish, and there's such a distance from rail to rail in the tail area that it wants to be on one rail or the other, and so they're good. Fishes are typically good boards for driving down the line. And the Dort inherited that, but it's much easier to break your line because of the wings. And the Dort 2 has all the elements that make it. It has less glide than the Dort, but it's still got a fair bit because of the width. But it's got more rocker, and it's thinner, and a squash tail, so it doesn't have that same fishy feeling. What other questions do we have?
Somebody mentioned the Moby fish, and I remember the shop we used to sell. We occasionally have people come in asking about it. What are the strengths of that board?
Moby fish. What are the strengths or the positives of the board? The first Moby fish I made was almost 20 years ago. It was for me. It was a 710. And, it was primarily made for, small shores or scripts or, North County reefs or cliffs. And my intentions were to, have it in my truck for surf that was maybe up to 3 foot, maybe 4 foot. And one day I went down to Black's, and I usually carried several boards with me. I usually carried a performance board and then a groveler type and maybe a step up. But this day I drove down to Black's. I didn't see much swell when I first checked the beaches in La Jolla. But I got down to the bottom of the road, and I went, holy shit, because the only board I had in my car was the Moby fish. And it was legitimate, bordering on canyon swell Blacks. It was solid 6 foot, kind of lowish tide, and with some bigger sets. And I said, well, it's fucking perfect. It was the only board I got, so I'm paddling out. And I was really surprised at how it was a quad. It was, and I was blown away at how well it held the wave face. Because when Black's is good, you kind of have to take off at an angle and run. And a lot of times when it's good, is when it's borderline being not just makeable or not makeable. And your wave selection determines whether or not you're going to make the wave or not. I mean, it does anywhere, but Black's can be 100+ yard long run, and the Moby fish. It was able to take off. It took off easier for some reason, and I could turn higher up in the face, which is important at Blacks. And it didn't seem to have a top end. I mean, every pump I was going faster and faster, and it held. It never really ever threatened to fall out, and I was pretty blown away at that session. So I started making a few more for a few people. And that's been our by far our most popular bigger board. I have the Yeti and the Big Cat and the Zeppelin. The Zeppelin is a kind of a cruiser, full template, big guy board. The Yeti is a big guy step up, and the Big Cat is a big guy hot dog board. But the Moby is by far the most versatile, and it's over time. I used to make them like 7.6 to. I made myself an 11-footer once, but some of the sons of some of the guys who have been getting boards from me for years, the guys that have gotten some Moby fishes like 10 years ago, as their sons got better, they said, "Dad, can I try the board?" And they come back and they go, "Wow, can I get one?" Because guys normally ride 6.2, and they tried their dad's 8-footer, and they had so much fun. They wanted to add one to their quiver. And at the same time, guys are asking me, "Well, how short can I go?" So I introduced. I don't even think it's up on the internet yet, but I've been making the not so Moby fish for the last year and a half, 2 years, and the NSMF, not so Moby fish. I generally the Moby fishes under 7 foot kind of fall into that category. And it's, when you start to get down around the 6-foot zone, it still resembles a classic fish, but the nose is a little bit more pulled in. The tail's got a bit more curve in the outline. It's got more tail rocker, but a fairly low entry. The Moby fish is one of it's definitely our most popular. Although I just talked about the not so loaded fish, but it's definitely our most popular big guy board. And small wave cruiser. What else have we got?
What's the ideal board to use at lowers?
Oh, the ideal board to use at lowers. In my opinion, it's a 10-foot board with a ton of paddle, but I'm old. Board. The beauty of surfing is there's no one way to do it right. There's competitive surfing. 20 years ago, aerials were virtually unheard of, and now everybody in their, maybe not their uncle, but everybody and their brother can pretty much do aerials if you surf for a couple of years. Like competitive surfing is all about like crazy radical maneuvers, and but then there's recreational surfing, and it just depends on the lines that you want to take. What's the best board for trestles? Well, trestles, is arguably one of the most consistent, better waves on the coast. And when it gets bigger, it'll start to get semi-hollow, but generally it's not really a tube wave, but it's a long face with good push, and so you can ride longboards out there. You can ride eggs. You can ride fishes. You can ride SDs, and so it comes back to what your personal, what your style is, how you like to surf, and whether you're a cruiser, or maybe a mid-length performance guy, or maybe you're a guy that wants to try to learn how to do all the crazy maneuvers the pros are doing. It's just really a matter of taste, and that's the beauty of trestles. Really, is it's performance wave, but it's also it's not if you had 6 foot, 4 to 5 foot trestles, you could probably ride pretty much anything out there. 4 to 5 foot good blacks, you could ride about anything out there, but you wouldn't have nearly as much fun or success as you would with boards that are more designed for that hollow running wave. Got another question?
If somebody orders a custom Rusty off your site, can they get you to shape it for them?
Yeah.
Specifically you?
Yeah. I design 98% of our boards. Pedro, Rick Hammond, Rick is semi-retired, but Rick used to design a fair few, mainly customs, and Pedro He does pretty much customs. So the Chupacabra is his, and the Panda is his. So I take that back. I design maybe 85-90% of the boards. And, the customs these days, there's a lot of machines out there. There's a lot of computer designing. And as I said before, I think hand shaping is good. It's great up until you get to a point where you're doing, give or take, 1,000 boards a year, and the time that people have to wait for your boards is getting longer and longer. I used to have a 3-month wait just before it took me 3 months to get to an order, much less shape it. 3 months to shape the board, and then another month before it was completed. But nowadays, our turnaround time is. I think everybody's kind of busy right now, but PU is like 4 weeks, and anything with epoxy, like an E-poly or an EPS, is like 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks if it's a bigger board. And the torsion springs, there's not many people that know how to glass them, and we've got a great experienced epoxy guy doing those, but it still takes 6 to 7 weeks for the torsion springs. But what was the original question?
Well, you just spoke on torsion spring. I commonly have many of the kids that I know, including Antoine. What does torsion spring offer? What is the benefit to it?
What is the benefit of a torsion spring? Good question. And I've touched on this before, but it's, Dow makes different types of styrofoams and extruded styrofoam. And the extruded styrofoam, I'm sure there's other people that make it besides Dow, but Dow's the most common source. But it's blue. They color code it blue, and I think the minimum order is like $500,000 or something, maybe $100,000. But you can get white extruded foam from Dow, but and it's been around for decades and decades. It's the beauty of the extruded foam is. Let me wind back a little bit. The EPS is expanded polystyrene, and it starts out as little tiny hard beads. And forever, before surfboards really became a decent customer, there's a lot of companies that made expanded polystyrene, and the little beads get put into actually a big block. Enough to maybe make, guessing, 10 blanks out of. And the early blanks we used to get were big rectangles with the bottom rocker hot wired into it. And, it's kind of difficult to shape too, because the earlier stuff was kind of, the more pressure and heat you put on those beads, the tighter the bond is. Once they expand, the tighter the bond is, and the more and more water resistant it becomes. But it's very porous. The water moves in between the gaps in the beads, and EPS boards. If you get a dingle and you're surfing, you should probably maybe get a couple more good waves, but call it a day. I remember one of my first EPS boards. I was on a surf trip, and I got a ding, and normally with a PU board it wouldn't have been that big of an issue, but I kept surfing. The surf was perfect, and I surfed for a couple hours, and I came in, and I went, wow, my board really feels a lot heavier. So I put it up outside my beret, standing on the tail, and it over the course of 24 hours, there was a giant puddle underneath it. So, EPS has gotten better, but the extruded polystyrene, my first experience of it was with a guy that came up from Peru, and he said, try this foam. And I shaped it. It was a little bit tougher to shape, and we had to glass it with epoxy, but the flex on it was the flex on PU is as I said before, the thinner the board, the more flex you get, the lighter the glass job, and a thinner board, you get more flex. But the PU flex, once you've ridden an EPS board or a torsion string, it doesn't feel as alive. Like the EPS feels very frisky, and you can get, you can have two boards that are the same dimensions, say 6 foot long, and the PU board might weigh 6.5 pounds, and the EPS board will weigh 5.5 pounds, maybe even less. But then the torsion spring refers to the expanded the EPS, or there's a company up in North County called XTR, and he's the guy that bought the concept, I guess, off of Pedro from Peru. He's the guy that bought, the right or the know-how to build boards out of the extruded polystyrene, and they were sourcing the styrene in Asia, and they got it clear, and so what is good about torsion spring? Well, the extruded polystyrene is waterproof. I mean, that's why Dow offers it as a building material. It's basically doesn't accept water. The beads are put in a mold, but they're fused at even higher temperatures, so they actually melt. And then the foam is pushed, the chemical is pushed through an extruder and into the mold. And so instead of having a bead structure, which can be not very tight, or it can be pretty tight. There's some foams from Brazil that are pretty insane. EPS, that they're very expensive, but they're light and they're very strong and they're very well bonded. But the extruded, for all intents and purposes, is waterproof. And the flex, it's a livelier flex than PU. Maybe not as frisky as EPS, but it's got, because of the columns, they're basically vertical columns of foam. It's very good against pressure dings or pressure denting, and it is, as I said before, it's kind of in between weight between EPS and PU, and because the foam is more expensive and it's epoxy, it costs roughly 10-15% more than a regular PU board, but we're building a lot of them, and fortunately there's a size limit. We can't build a torsion spring much bigger than 7.2, but all the guys that are getting their shorter boards out of torsion spring are digging them, so a lot.
What do you think about the hatchet?
The hatchet is, I kind of started to make my reputation in the late 70s, but more so in the early 80s, when the whole world was riding kind of convex decks, and my team riders were pressuring me to go thinner and thinner, and so I made them thinner, but I had to compensate the volume somehow, so I made the rails a little bit thicker, but they were not boxy rails. They were angular rails, so the bottom of the rail still had a bit of bite to it, but then the top part of the rail was full because the deck extended out farther towards the rail and it stayed flatter. But the early 80s is when I started to gain my reputation, because the boards were different, and I had Aki riding them. I actually had some great team riders before Aki. Greg Day, Richard Cram would get a few boards, Mike Burness from South Africa, Wes Lane, and several more. And I made young 16-year-old Aki aboard, and he was traveling, so he didn't ride it right away, but he left it here, and he came back, surfed the OP Pro, and then he took the board back to Australia, and he won the he won the Aussie Pro Junior, which is the most prestigious amateur event in Australia. But anyways, so fast forward in time, a few years ago, somebody got interested in doing a limited edition of the '84. So I built 100, and half of them ended up on people's walls, and half of them got ridden, and people were psyched, and they're pressuring me to make them 84s. And I go, well, we kind of deal with hockey. We're going to make 100, but a couple of years prior to that, I had made a couple of concave deck models like the Fish Quattro and so many models I can't fucking remember them, but the Fish Quattro was definitely a concave deck board. So we started making the Blade, which is basically the Aki model in concave bottom or a like 4-channel board, but we took the beak off of it, so it was not. It had a little bit more rocker and a little bit more updated bottom, and so we made the Blade, and a lot of people really liked it. So we decided to do the Shiv, which is the SD for all intents and purposes, with a flat deck, and the hatchet. The hatchet's a little bit fuller outline. It's a swallowtail, and it's a good all around board. It's especially good in smaller ways, but it looks back at a couple of our boards that had a fuller outline, a swallowtail, and a couple of flat decks. So it's part of a series of the Blade, the Shiv, the Hatchet. And the 419 Fish is somewhat of a flat deck. It's not a perfectly flat deck. And then we've got a couple of models out there too that have flatter decks. But yeah, the Hatchet's it's a part of the series that we released last year on flat deck boards, and more people are starting to realize the benefits of a flat deck board. Basically, the flat deck boards are about a 1/4 inch thinner, so your two surfaces are closer to each other, so they flex a little bit easier. They're a little bit livelier. They're funny. They kind of stay up on the water because all the volume's out on the rail, but because of the rail shape, they bite. It takes a session or two to get used to them, but once people do, they swear that they paddle better, they catch waves easier. They're a weird combination of stable yet very maneuverable, and for the most part, pretty fast. The Hatchet, the Shiv is designed for maybe better surf, and then the Blade, which is a good all-around board. The 84 is a little bit lower rocker. It's got more of a very slight concave in the middle that leads into a V that's deepest in front of the fins and fades off the tail. I got time for one or two more questions.
How did you come up with the SD model?
The SD. The SD was for stab in the dark. In this particular episode, it was Dane Reynolds, and it was pretty easy to. I mean, at first wasn't sure, but it was pretty easy to figure out who it was. Top pro, his weight, his height, and so I made, and the testing was going to be in South Africa. So I made a board with a little bit more rocker than I'd been doing, a bit deeper concave, and I made the tail a pretty rounded squash tail, rounder than usual, and with a slight bump in the template about 11, 12 inches up. And Dane wrote it, and he dug it. It wasn't his top choice, but he trashed some of the other boards. We didn't really have anything to say about the board except the tail template was weird. But the segment of him, he was ripping on the board. And so we were encouraged to make a model out of it, and it eventually became, my son named it the SD. I go, what? The pottery logo? But it caught on. So names are funny. Maybe I'll get into names of surfboards next episode. But anyways, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week and stay healthy.